you're doing fine. So we're continuing our series of React.js, and today we're going to go a little bit deeper. If this is your first time, I kindly recommend that you go back to episode 1 and episode 2 so that you can follow along. Okay, so what are we going to be discussing today? So today we're just going to look at creating components as well as nesting components and writing markups. Okay, now, we all know that React apps are made of components, okay? So like a component is just a piece of the user interface. So it can be anything. It can be an image, it can be a button, it can be a list or anything that you can mention, okay? And then it has got its own logic and appearance. Okay, so React components are just JavaScript functions that return a markup. So to those of you who know HTML, the word markup is not something that is new. Yeah, so because HTML simply means hypertext markup language. So that's just a structure. Okay, so this is an example of a component. So in this case, we just created a button. Okay, so function, my button, then it is returning a markup. Okay, let us see how we can create this React component in our application. Okay, so previously we had created a hello world component and then we rendered it to our web application. But then I didn't go deeper into explaining everything because we just wanted to create a hello world application. And today we've learned that a component is just a basic building block of a UI. It can be anything. Okay, so now let us see how we can create this UI component. So previously I showed you how to create a component as a separate JSX file and then nesting it, or rather calling it in the app.jsx. But today we're going to do something different. We're going to learn how to create a component inside the app.jsx. So let us just get rid of this. Okay, also get rid of this, but to maintain the CSS for now. Okay, so as illustrated earlier on, what you want to do is declare a function, my button. Okay, now my button should return a markup. Okay, so in this case we say return. Okay, then what markup do you want to return? Return a button. Okay, then let's just say click me. Okay, so as simple as that, that is how you create a React component. Okay, it will just return a single markup. Okay, so in this case, we're just returning a button. Now, how do we render this button onto our web page? In short, how do we nest it? So the process of rendering UI components in React app, we call it as rendering. Okay, nesting. So let us learn how to nest this component. Okay, so in order for us to nest this component, it's very simple and straightforward. In our function for the app here, we have to return that function. Now, how do you return this component? Okay, first things first, you return it as a markup, starting with the way the function is called. So in this case, the function was called as my button with a capital letter B. Okay, my button. So when you call it in that manner, that is when it can be rendered. Okay, let us run this application. So you shouldn't forget this command whenever I want to run a React application. It's npm run dev. Okay, so once we run that, we just click control and then click on the server that was started. Okay, once you click on it, it opens, and as you can see, we've created this component, a button, and it's click me. So that is a single component that is being rendered in this case. Okay. So now on your own, you can just go ahead and create as many components as you can, and then try to render them and see how it will look, just to test yourself and just for you to understand with the hands-on. Okay, now that we've learned how to create a React component just as we had done it in Visual Studio Code, I also talked a bit about nesting of those components. So nesting is just basically where you uh, nest a component in another component. Okay, so like in an example here that I've given, as you can see, we created a function called my button. Then we had nested that my button in the app component. Okay, and then you also need to take note, always remember that components begin with a capital letter. Okay, so the moment you create a component with uh, a small letter, it will bring errors. Okay, so always use caps as the first letter of your component, and then lowercase letters are treated as HTML tags. Okay, so always put that in mind. Now, markup. So the syntax that we've been using all along is not really HTML, but rather JSX. So JSX is just an acronym for JavaScript XML. Okay, and then you have to remember that JSX is stricter than HTML. Now, what does this mean? You always have to begin with a capital letter whenever you are rendering components. Okay, and then all those single tags that don't always have a closing tag, you always have to include a slash in order for you to close that component. And if you don't add that, it will bring errors for you. Okay, and then remember, a React component can only return a single JSX markup. But then how do you return multiple lines? Okay, so in order for you to return multiple lines, as you can see here, I have used these tags, the opening and the closing, these empty tags. Okay, they are more like a div, the way you use a div in HTML. Okay, to segment a certain block of code. Okay, or rather to wrap up a certain part of your web page. It's the same way. So in React, we don't use div. You can use div, but it is more appropriate to use these closing and opening and closing wrappers. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how this really works. Okay, so now let us see how we can retain multiple markups inside a React component. So I'll just comment out that. Okay, so let us create a component called about. Okay, okay, then let us return. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier on, you need to use these opening and closing markup tags. Okay, so I want to go ahead and use. Okay, okay, so once we've created that about component, which is retaining multiple markups, we want to go ahead and nest it in here. So we need to render it. Okay, so we call it about, then we close. Okay, so once we save, let us run our server npm. Okay, so once that is done, when you run our application, we're going to see this rendered. About us, this is a simple React component, and click me. Okay, so what happens, let us see what happens if we don't use these opening and closing markup tags. Okay, let us say we remove them. Okay, so even Visual Studio Code itself, it shows you to say you can't retain multiple lines when creating a React component. Okay, you cannot retain one component. So check what happens when I comment out this part. Okay, the error is gone. Why? Because React only accepts one component to be retained. But if you want to retain multiple markups, you always have to use these, the opening and closing markup tags, in order for you to retain multiple lines, okay, of your application of the component. Thank you for watching. That's all for today.